Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. We're into the last week of a year that must go down as the worst since independence, but not just because of COVID-19, writes TN Nainen in his weekly column in Business Standard. The year began with protests against a citizenship law by people who feared potential statelessness. As the year comes to a close, farmers are sitting at Delhi's borders in protest against three new farm laws. And on the Ladakh border, India is tackling the loss of large stretches of land to Chinese control. As the country enters the third decade of the century, one thing is clear: its institutions and instincts, resources and reserves will face tough stress tests. It is time the most powerful government of the past 3 decades reminded itself of the promises it made. Good days, good governance, and progress for everyone, he says. This week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the Aligarh Muslim University, and Shekhar Gupta calls it his first outreach to India's alienated Muslim minority. His tone and proposition to Muslims again seemed contrary to his party's politics and actions, he writes. Has the BJP government realized the downside of pushing too hard with its strategy so far? What might have brought on this change? More than a change of heart, we're probably seeing a shift in tactics for a time when the global picture is changing and India's economic growth has diminished, argues Shekhar Gupta. This change in approach may have been brought about because the world is changing and India's vulnerabilities have risen. What do the employment data tell us so far about the recovery in the third quarter? To answer this, we must understand the recovery process, writes Mahesh Vyas in a weekly column for the Business Standard. Employment fell sharply to about 320 million in the first quarter from 406 million. Much of this fall was recovered in the second quarter, but in the first 2 months of the current quarter, employment in fact fell. The initial gains had come as the self-employed got back to work, and desperation drove daily wage laborers to accept any form of employment. Soon these options were exhausted. Unless there's a big surprise in the last 10 days of December, the employment in the current quarter would be 2.5% lower than the 405 million employed in the year-ago quarter, he writes. Debashish Basu says the fairy tale outcome of the farm reforms would be better infrastructure and market access, which could take the rural economy to new heights. But the reforms have angered farmers. No matter how the protests are sorted out, the government will still have to handle implementation. There's no escaping from the huge effort needed to substitute the currently restrictive APMC structure with a more reliable trading and price discovery mechanism. But price is only one part. Farmers then will have to deliver the produce. To support both price and delivery, we will need strong contracts. It is this part of the fairy tale that looks utopian and can lead to distress, writes Basu. The question of who should get the vaccine first is controversial. The government has broadly signaled its willingness to follow WHO guidelines on priority groups, but there has been little communication on what India-specific tweaks will be made, writes Mihir Sharma in an editorial for Business Standard. For instance, who counts as a health worker? What about contract workers at public hospitals? Do they count? And who are frontline workers? Fact is, age is by far the greatest factor for severe infections. After extensive research, the UK has prioritized those above 65 years along with health workers. Similarly, the Indian government needs evidence-based policy making rather than appeasing one group or another, writes Sharma. Jaimini Bhagwati takes a look at two looming challenges for India that he thinks the government should treat as its New Year's resolutions. First, corporate defaults and NPAs were highlighted 6 years ago. Since then, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code has been beaten down thanks to motivated owners of failed businesses. If the central government is sincere about reviving long-term bank lending, it needs to identify heads of regulatory institutions that are not malleable, says Bhagwati. Second, although every effort must be made to get things back to normal with China, India has no option but to be prepared for a two-front war. So India's defense budget should be raised by at least 2% of GDP, Bhagwati writes. In a column for Business Standard, Shailesh Dhobal gives us three trends that will stick around even in a post-pandemic world. First is direct to home. Habits picked up while being cooped up at home for months and receiving everything from products to services at your doorstep will be hard to kick. Second is digital. Digitization was a distant goal brought forward by the pandemic. Lastly, sustainability. Consumers are buying more local, limiting waste, and care more about the environment, health, and social metrics while choosing products and services to buy. As a business, you simply cannot afford to ignore sustainability, writes Noble. The vandalism at the Karnataka factory of Westron, Apple's Taiwanese supplier, is a cautionary tale both for companies looking to relocate their manufacturing to India and for the state labor departments that oversee them, writes Business Standard in an editorial. The incident represents an all-around failure of the company's HR establishment, of the state labor inspection, and the handling of complaints. It could also be regarded as a test case for the government's Production-Linked Incentive or PLI scheme. If such failures happen in states such as Karnataka with a fairly advanced manufacturing base, it's worth wondering what about those that are trying to attract investment but lack government efficiency, the editorial says. In an editorial, Business Standard questions the reasoning behind suspending the normal operation of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code (IBC) for another 3 months. The IBC was suspended for new defaults when the lockdown was imposed in March. The initial suspension made sense because the purpose of the IBC is to deal with those businesses that are insolvent and not the ones facing a temporary crisis of liquidity. The issue is whether this logic continues to hold 9 months on when the government says green shoots of growth are visible, the editorial says. Farmers have been protesting on the outskirts of Delhi for nearly a month now with no clear solution in sight. Taking an extreme position is unlikely to resolve the standoff, and the government has again invited farmers for talks, writes Business Standard in an editorial. The basic issue is farm incomes and the MSP provide some certainty to farmers. While the government will continue with the MSP policy, it is clear that it cannot go on doing open-ended procurement forever. Also, farmers in Punjab and Haryana cannot go on producing wheat and rice. This cycle is unsustainable. However, diversification would entail cost and risks. This is where state governments would need to do more in terms of providing support, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.